this is your first time listening to our podcast, welcome. Our programming brings a diversity of voices connected to Myanmar to share their perspectives, thoughts, and reflections about what has been happening there since the military coup last year. All of our guests share one thing in common: a deep personal stake in the ongoing crisis. And it is an honor for us to be able to bring these voices into your earbuds. But however difficult it may be to hear some of their stories, we hope that you'll come away with a deeper and more nuanced understanding of what is happening there. You're about to listen to an interview that seems like it was recorded long ago. The talk is not, in fact, that old in terms of time, but it took place before the coup and even before the pandemic, and it almost feels as though it was from another age altogether. The interview was recorded in person in Yangon, and it was meant to be produced and released soon after. However, the world had other plans, and our podcast platform shifted gears as we tried to be responsive to a steady stream of unexpected events. When the pandemic hit Myanmar, we launched a series exploring how COVID was impacting daily life there, including monasteries and meditation centers. Then, with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, we launched another series examining racism and prejudice in Buddhist and meditation communities. Finally, after the military coup was launched in February 2021, we shelved all of our projects to focus exclusively on that. However, we've now decided to circle back to our archive and release some interviews from what now feels like almost from another century. In these discussions, practitioners earnestly discuss their spiritual path before the dark days of a deadly virus, a collapsing economy, diminishing freedoms, and the Burmese military's campaign of terror. These precious interviews remind us about the tremendous gifts that Myanmar has to offer the world in the form of a spiritual practice that teaches an end of suffering and the promise of full liberation. They are an important reminder that helps break down the one-dimensional view of the country as simply another failed state, bound by poverty and violence, and perennially in need of help and sympathy. As we know, the reality is also that Myanmar has been freely distributing the priceless teachings of liberation to anyone ready to undertake the practice, as so many of these stories attest. At the same time, these interviews are not meant to distract from or ignore the terrible tragedy and suffering that so many Burmese have been experiencing since the coup, but rather to balance out the harsh reality that so many of our other interviews delve into. These powerful reflections of the spiritual journey should in no way be seen to advocate non-involvement or invite, let alone justify, spiritual bypass. In any case, in an age of access to nearly infinite content, we thank you for choosing to spend the next 2 hours with us and hope you find benefit in the discussion that follows. Okay, so here we are. Just had a great meal. Really glad you could make it. Great that we can also connect in this way in a Dhamma conversation about Myanmar.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me and for the wonderful lunch and also for the wonderful furniture that
that you're sitting on here and at home. And
absolutely.
Yeah. So you've been in Yangon 5 years, I think?
Yes, 5 years in April.
Yeah, how are you finding it?
Good. It's different. It's been a very, very good experience. Just it's a bit challenging at points, and then easy in other ways. And also constantly changing, as we spoke about earlier, just how fast things are moving, and yet still how unique things are here.
Yeah, definitely. Things we'll get into later as we explore how you've gotten here and where you've come from. And to start off from there, to go back to your story, you're obviously quite invested in Buddhist meditation and your life in Myanmar. But in terms of how you got here, you've mentioned before in sharing your background that suffering, addiction, trauma were the things that led you to meditation. Suffering is something that leads a lot of us to a practice of inner peace. The latter two, maybe not as much as a given. People can definitely have suffering, but not take a certain road or path to find out how to alleviate it. So can you give us some background on your early years in New York and the forms that these struggles took and what you did with it?
Sure. I think growing up in New York was a good experience, but did have its challenges. I started using drugs and alcohol by the first time that I was in rehab was in 9th grade.
Wow.
So I guess 14 years old or so. And at that point I had already been blacking out from drinking on a regular basis, was smoking 1 or 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and quite heavily into drugs. But it was actually a stepping point from there, after spending a few months in rehab, actually learning more about drugs and how to use them and where and all these other aspects of it. So I got out and continued to use, and it was just that was the world I knew growing up. It wasn't until I was 20 years old or so when I first started learning more about meditation and yoga initially. So at 20 years old, I stopped everything. I stopped smoking cigarettes, doing drugs, drinking, became vegetarian, went on this whole kick, and it's when I first started reading about meditation. My first kind of experience with it was through yoga. So just those few seconds at the end of a yoga session where, I was getting in touch with my breath and sitting in a certain way. And there was just something there. I liked yoga and I continued to do yoga, but there was something about the meditation in that moment that really just captured me. And I started to pick up books and learn more about it. I was living in New York at the time, in Brooklyn, and luckily there were a lot of different options. So I started going to a Zen center in Brooklyn and studying a bit there, and came across some different forms of meditation and dabbled for some time. And it wasn't something that I was doing as regularly in the beginning. It was an interest. It was a distraction. At that point in my life, all I had known was when dealing with stress, when dealing with good things, bad things, anything, there was a reason to drink. There was a reason to party and
Did you have a lot of difficult things happening in your childhood, or was it more just your response to the normal things?
Growing up in New York, my parents divorced or separated when I was 6 or 7 years old. My father was an alcoholic and an addict of sorts, and my mom had a lot of challenges, a lot of partners and boyfriends, and I was sexually abused by one of them for several years while he lived with us. and also did cocaine and crack in the house.
Wow. Yeah, those are some heavy influences.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I clearly remember having friends at that age, and I was one of the only people that was a product of divorce at an early age, and this was in, I guess, the early 80s. And I remember having friends or people I was with sitting around in an elementary school playground, and one of them saying I was most likely to be a smoker. And I thought it was so ridiculous at that time because I had asthma, and I was really against my father smoking. My father smoked like 3 or 4 packs of cigarettes a day. Really ridiculous. You know, that's like 60 or 80 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
I'm not even sure how it was possible. But I was so against it. And then I clearly remember a few years later being like 11 or 12 years old and starting to smoke and smoking the same cigarettes my father smoked. And then...
we go to what's familiar, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then starting to drink. And, you know, I clearly remember being a kid and my dad taking me to bars during the day because he worked at night. So I'd be playing backgammon with his friends, and then I remember having to wake him up because I ended up moving back in with my dad a few years after they were separated. So after I got out of rehab, I moved in with him, and we were living together. It was basically two kind of single men living together in a house, and he worked nights, so he would literally leave the house at 11 o'clock at night, and I'd have to wake him up, and sometimes I'd be waking him up in his car because he was passed out drunk from, you know, from being drinking all day, and but then I had the whole house to myself all night, so I would have friends over and parties and lots of debauchery along the way. And just kind of became a lifestyle, especially during my teenage years. And this went on. I recall seeing my father, you know, smoking marijuana, and then I remember being at a place with him one time, and it was his birthday, and the first time I saw him do cocaine. And, you know, just these things that kind of... This was the life that I saw and knew, and this was just commonplace for me that, you know, I didn't see people not smoking or not doing drugs or not drinking.
Our conditions are what make us.
Yeah. And it was one of those difficult moments of, and my father had thrown me out of the house or asked me to leave when I was, I think, 18 or 19, and I was trying to go to community college in the U.S. and no direction, no idea what I wanted to do. So I was forced to get out, and I had like 2 weeks to get out of the house. It was a really dark, low point. I ended up going to stay with my mom, who was extremely depressed at the time, living in this basement apartment half a block from these projects, is public housing in the U.S., and it was a really difficult area. And for about 3 months or perhaps 6 months or so, we lived in this small studio basement apartment where we were sleeping on the same couch, kind of head to toe. And I was working in a restaurant as a kind of busboy, and then in the kitchen and trying to go to community college. And I eventually, about 6 months later, found a job on Wall Street as a runner, just making like $5 an hour with no benefits or anything, and no idea what was going on. But I was working on the New York Stock Exchange. Didn't own a suit or a tie or anything at the time, but kind of just figured things out. I ended up spending over 10 years on the New York Stock Exchange.
Wow. It's quite a difference.
Yeah.
So when you were turning to some of these drugs and alcohol, perhaps as a way to escape suffering or deal with difficult emotions, do you remember when you started to realize that this wasn't working and that the thing you were turning to avoid or relieve suffering was actually suffering itself?
There were moments. So this first time when I turned 20, I was sober for over 3 years and was a completely different person. But it was very difficult because when I became sober, I didn't know how to be a human. I didn't know how to engage in a way that didn't involve alcohol and drugs and smoking, and I really had to learn how to respond, how people that weren't using these tools and these objects as to cope with life or to engage socially. What do people do? Where do they go? How do you have a conversation that doesn't involve some sort of partying or use of these substances in this way? And it was very difficult. A lot of emotions that had been suppressed were starting to come out.
Sure.
Anxiety and all the things that people should be developing naturally in their, as they're growing up through adolescence, was suppressed for me in many ways. So I had to really work on that and see, how do you just have a conversation? How do you deal with stress? How do you sleep at night without having something to do it? What do you do after a hard day at work or a good day at work or for a holiday or a birthday or, and at the same time, everyone in my life up until that point, or almost everyone in my life, also was using these things and to deal with their circumstances. So a lot of it was changing who I was around and where I was, but so much was around inner work. I was reading a lot at the time and going to 12-step groups, which had helped, but at the same time, I didn't fully relate to them. They were often looking at, 12-step programs are often faith-based, and I didn't have a strong connection with Christian or Catholic faiths or Judaism or other common kind of approaches that were around me at the time. This is where I did start to look more at yoga and then at meditation as a way of learning how to be with and understand the self more, and understand the conditions of where we were. Well, there was a lot of influential writing for me at the time, a lot of the standards of Khalil Gibran and Pema Chodron, and then later on Sharon Salzberg and Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein, and but some of that came in later. As I said, I stayed sober without using drugs and alcohol for about 3 years, and then 9/11 happened.
Oh.
And it was a really pivotal moment. I was working on Wall Street at the time, on the trading floor at the New York Stock Exchange, and so I was literally 3 blocks away from the World Trade Center. Our whole building shook when the planes hit.
Wow.
And I, still right now, I can still feel my body reacting to it as I say it. And, going outside and there were ashes falling down, and, I looked directly at the Trade Center and saw the holes that were made in it. And, I was one of the people that was lucky enough to get out over the bridge, and I was on the Brooklyn Bridge when the towers fell down, and watched this puff of smoke just overtake the city, and it was quite surreal. We were also the first people back into that area that were not first responders, because the New York Stock Exchange was seen as this beacon of the strength of the U.S. and of this world, and they had us down there just a few days later. So we were going past people in hazmat suits and a lot of armed military, and walking past the remnants of the Twin Towers that were still smoking, and it was walking through a war zone. It was really difficult because this was a place that I knew so well, and that we were, it was something that I had grown up around, and it affected us, affected people in that area deeply, as it affected so many people at the time. And I recall many people saying that they'd never be going back down to work, and and big life changes were coming, and for most people, they settled back into their lifestyles and into the comfort of their lives, because that's what people often do. It was a reality check, though. It was also the first time that I had a cigarette in that 3 years or so.
When? On 9/11, 9/12?
On 9/11. I lived in Brooklyn at the time, and I remember going up to my roof, and, family and friends kept contacting me, and the phone systems were all down, so no one could get in contact with me for several hours. And I remember friends that I had known from my past that I hadn't been in contact with in some time were really worried and came out to see me, and they were still using drugs and so forth. And at first I had a cigarette, and that cigarette was just as we were watching the smoke of the towers from my rooftop in Brooklyn. That cigarette evolved over the weeks and months into beers again, and then drinking, and then drugs. And the next 2.5 years was a very intense time of partying and just really being lost in that space. And then there was a moment that I looked around, and I just realized that everything around me was empty. There was no fun anymore. It was kind of, different faces, but the same experience, the same cycle, these ups and downs, and it all just became so dissatisfying that I couldn't bear to go on in that way. And it was over 15 years ago. So it was in November. It was after a Thanksgiving weekend where I'd spent 4 days just using copious amounts of drugs, and it was just this time when it was enough. It was so empty, so meaningless. And not long after that, I ended up finding a group in New York. At the time, it was called Dharma Punx, and it was led by Noah Levine, or
Right.
Levine, sorry.
Yeah.
And it was a group of people sitting around meditating with tattoos like me, and and talking about life in a very open and genuine way. It was really authentic. There was, or at least there felt like there was very little pretense. People could come as they were. Many people in the group were in recovery. had pasts that were littered with drug use and with suffering, and it was really easy for me to relate and fit in there. And it was a weekly meditation group that met in the Bowery across from CBGB's, which was like this center of punk music and, counterculture in many ways. And it was interesting because I would go up there after working on Wall Street all day and be sitting around in such an interesting paradox. And I really found community there. And that group was based on more of Vipassana practices, and it was something that I connected to quite a bit. And from there, I spent a few years studying with that group and learning from them.
So your sobriety and recovery and Dhamma practice seemed like they were all happening around the same time?
Absolutely. I got sober, I stopped using drugs, and then I maintained that because of meditation, because of the Dhamma practice. And
at Dharma Punx?
Yes, yeah, definitely played a strong role in that. A few months into it, I was with my partner, my current wife, and we were living in Brooklyn as well, and we got an apartment together for the first time, and our landlord was opening a yoga studio, and knew that we had been meditating and going to classes and stuff, and she asked us to offer a weekly meditation class there. We weren't really qualified to do it at the time, but did take it on. So we had a community there as well that we used to learn together, and we're bringing in kind of different traditions and trying to get people just to really look at different ways of meditating, different approaches to it. And so we had this kind of two communities that we were spending time in there.
It's interesting hearing about you say the role Dharma Punx played, because it's making me, and we'll probably get into this later in the conversation, but when you look at how the Buddhist teachings have to be contextual in their environment, this is something that, if you know about Burmese history and Lady Sayadaw and a 19th century monk and what he did to reposition the teachings so that they were relevant in an increasingly colonial environment to that group of Burmese. As the teachings have spread outside of Myanmar into Western countries, they've done similar kinds of things. But here you are saying, you're living in an environment where there are different Dhamma teachings you can go, but what you need are people, maybe you don't need this per se, but something that definitely makes you feel comfortable are people with tattoos in New York City who are going through their own sobriety, and that by having opportunities where the Dhamma is able to come out through these very unique contextual environments, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's able to find a community with people and then get a teaching of liberation in a comfortable way. Well, it's never comforting because it's always something we have to struggle with, but you don't have to step completely outside of your cultural, religious, linguistic background to access it. You can stay in something comfortable and receive those teachings in there. And it's an interesting topic to think of as these teachings are spreading and going into different places.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I didn't realize it at the time, the importance of that community. And how strong that role of, Sangha in this form of, community, perhaps not monks and nuns, but looking at how much of that helped stabilize and ignite this interest and this fire of going further into these practices. At the time, I recall really looking at it very much as, how is this going to help me? And these interest in this type of practice, looking at Vipassana and really having a teacher to focus on that with. But, reflecting, and as you said, the importance of having people around and the terminology, the local language to connect with people about it, I think played a critical role in keeping that and staying on the path and not just jumping to the next thing. Although I did quite a bit over the years, looking at all these different options of practices.
Yeah, and that's what I want to get to next. I have in front of me, you gave me your spiritual background, you can say. I'll read off what you shared with me just to give the listener an idea of the diversity of this. You range across several traditions: Theravada, Vipassana, Zen, Vajrayana. Did I say that correctly? I'm not as familiar with Mahayana practices.
Oh, Vajrayana.
Vajrayana, okay. And yoga, you studied with Ajahn Tong Sirimangalo.
Yes.
In Thailand,
Yeah.
Who you mentioned studied with Mahasi Sayadaw, with Martine Batchelor, Vipassana and Zen influence teacher, Bhikkhuni Anizamba, Mahayana, Noah Levine, as you mentioned, Vinny Ferraro, the Big Heart City Sangha, and you attended Goenka retreats as well. You also did this, you're in your final year of a 2-year mindfulness meditation teacher certificate program with Jack Kornfield and Tara Brock. And apologies for any of the previous mispronunciation. You mentioned you've also studied at retreats in Nepal. What tradition?
It would be Vajrayana also. It was in the Kagyupa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism.
That's what I was trying not to pronounce. And Goenka in India, Vipassana in the U.S., also in Thailand, Wat Doi Sutep, Wat Chom Tong, Myanmar at Shui Min. So this is an extraordinary background of practice with teachers across countries, cultures, traditions, sects, Mahayana and Theravada. What I'm wondering about this kind of diversity is this a reflection of looking for the perfect teacher, or just finding different teachers where you're at different points in your life, or adding a diversity of tools in your toolbox?
I would say all of the above. It's often, and I remember Jack Kornfield talking about this idea of this almost supermarket on offer of these many teachings that we now have. And, as the world becomes smaller and we have access to more information and more ability to travel, how this has opened up so much. And it was in some way looking for the perfect teaching or teacher and trying to find what worked for the conditions that I was facing, and obviously it just goes into this idea of the grass is always greener, and you're seeing all these different possibilities, and can you become enlightened in one lifetime, and what to focus on? Do you focus on the breath at the tip of the nose in anapanasati, or are you looking at repetition of mantras? Are you sitting satsang and having these experiences, or visualizations with Vajrayana and tantric practices? And there was just so much available, and in many ways, reflecting on it, it does lean towards some of the earlier conditioning and behaviors that we bring in, and think about some of the addictive behaviors that I had early on in my life, and those behaviors that still come through, and looking for a quick fix to something, or to have an experience that's going to really be exciting, or this different intentions behind some of these things. What's motivating that? I've been lucky to be able to try out many of these different things and experience them and sit with different teachers, and I'm quite grateful for all of the experiences over the years. I think in the beginning it was very much about acquiring something, attaining, but also learning. And I was just so passionate about the Dharma, about meditation and these practices, and it was just, there was such a transformation that occurred in those early years, those first few years of practice, that just pushed me to keep looking and wanting more and experiencing more, and there was a lot to learn. There's, each time you go down one path, other things open up, and you start to learn more, and you want to kind of check that out, investigate it more. And then from there, things just unfolded. Some of them more naturally, and along the way, some have really integrated themselves into the practice that I now do, and others have kind of fallen away, but have still been experiences along that path. I now find a lot of it to have kind of broken down into a very simple structure and practice, and rather than how complicated and rigid I made things early on. At points I felt that there were times when you needed to really focus on one thing and go very deep into it, and only do it this way, and there was a lot of inflexibility, a lot of rigidity in it. And I now find that it's more of just experiences that have culminated into what's here now, into the conditions and kind of approach now that I take.
It is interesting because you talk about the different traditions that you're doing could be somewhat related to an addictive background of wanting the next thing. And it is interesting how we bring our defilements into our very active meditation. If you're too hard of a worker, then you could be too hard of a worker in meditation. If you're even the process of doing the meditation can be approached with those mindsets that are there. To follow up, some teachers and traditions, they emphasize that you should put all your energy just in one direction, not to dig too many holes looking for water, but to dig deeply in one place. You've done all these traditions and different practices. To what extent did you find that these different practices supported and complemented each other? And to what extent did you find that they had a measure of conflict or confusion?
I would say it's interesting. It really depends on the mindset and perspectives of how you see these different practices. Just thinking to how the Buddha had given many different objects for meditation and possible ways to approach meditation. And it really looks at what fits for the individual and for the circumstances. I would say at different points in my life, I needed different approaches to meditation, to learning. And I would say in that way, it's not that I was just dabbling in different things. These were tools that have come in and work better in different situations. So in that way, I would say that they can complement each other. And I think it's important to find what works for the individual and how that can be adapted to the circumstances. For some, the structure of a Goenka practice is needed because of the behaviors that they bring in, the conditions that they're bringing in, or in the same way with Mahasi, with noting, and some people really need to have a structured focus while sitting in that to be able to stay mindful and to be aware and awake, whereas others already bring a lot of structure into into their sitting space, into their practice, and having a more open practice can be more freeing, where, working with an open awareness could really help balance their concentration and their ability to understand.
Right, and that segues to my next question, which is one about culture. So you're talking about different practices affecting people differently based on their personality, their background, individually, but then in a wider sense, you have the culture, and you've practiced in a number of different cultures, culture of the tradition, as well as the culture of the country, Nepal, Thailand, Burma, Japan, US. What have you seen so far as cultures impacting the teachings of these places, and teachings being modified and adapted with specific cultures in mind, whether they're cultures of countries or cultures of communities, as in the case of your Dharma Punx?
I would say, when we look at it, especially looking at how in Southeast Asia and even East Asia in many ways, how intertwined Buddhism and the culture are. It's hard to separate the two, and it can be difficult for people coming in that aren't of that culture to understand how to navigate through a lot of the ritualistic aspects and the traditions within that, and that can sometimes be a barrier to understanding the Dharma and understanding or even benefiting from the practices that they may engage in those countries. I've seen that quite a bit over the years, and one of the things we were working on when we were in Thailand was how to make these practices more accessible, and how to find a balance between that without taking away from the culture and these traditions, but still creating a space where people understand the core practices. And even sometimes within a culture that is rooted in Buddhism, it's sometimes hard to find the actual meditative practices, because a lot of it comes down to prayer and ritual and formality and more cultural rather than practice.
Right. So before we interviewed earlier today, we were talking about the earlier podcast with Alan Clements and talking about the difficult conditions that Alan faced in the 80s and how he persevered, and making the comment that, not every meditator can do this. And you've certainly been in a number of these Southeast Asian countries, not just as a practitioner, but also as trying to find a way to bridge this East and West. And a lot of these Westerners coming today are facing conditions much, much milder than what we learned about with Alan's situation in an oppressive government in the 1980s. But still, they can be enough of some kind of barrier that makes it hard for them, for Westerners, to access deeper teachings. What kinds of problems and challenges have you seen?
A lot of it is misunderstandings. Also time. People coming that are very interested in meditation but aren't at a place to dedicate enough time to go to a center and spend 10 days or 21 days or a month. And, there seems to be some disconnect between expectations from centers, meditation centers and other places of learning, and what students have available or have allocated to be able to really find a common ground on what's going to work. The difficulty sometimes in coming in with having little or no meditation experience or experience around the Dharma, and to have to jump into a 10-day course or a longer course is quite a lot, especially when they don't fully understand what they're getting into many times. And sometimes there's limited guidance in how to navigate one, the teachings, then the practices, the structure and expectations around how to eat, dress, keep things, tidy, take part in these centers, kind of community, without even looking at how to actually access the teachings. Also in different ways of learning, in terms of questioning and versus more learning through experience and through listening rather than conversing. And there's a lot of potential for challenges along the way in what I've seen and experienced over the years with these two things coming together.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned the challenge that new students can have coming to the practice. I would add to that the challenge old students can have, because old students coming with their own traditions, their own sense of how the teachings came to them in their countries, and coming with a certain sense of arrogance and righteousness of how things should be. So on both ends of the scale, you get that.
Absolutely. There's this disconnect there. And I think there isn't, or I haven't seen much space for dialogue between cultures in that way, at least in this region around that. There are dialogues happening at higher levels globally with some teachers and heads of traditions, but at the level of at centers and places.
And practitioners.
Yes.
I totally agree. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is I think these ground level stories are the ones that are the most compelling, interesting, identifiable. Some of the higher level stories are, at least for me and the community that I'm with, sometimes much further from our reality and issues. And when I first came here, I was confused by the fact that here, it's like you're thinking and you're saying and you're conversing with local Burmese. Okay, we're doing the same practice. We have the same goals. We have the same the same acceptance of what the Buddha taught and his basic teachings and what we have to do with it. And I believe that's to such an extent that I couldn't understand the differences that would develop. I didn't have a mental capacity to see what was actually taking place. I was minimizing or explaining away or being arrogant or uncomfortable or something. And there was nowhere I could go to read or listen or hear or converse to learn about where these differences were arising. And over time, these differences became much more important to me than anything else. These differences of how we're taking the teachings in as a community, as an individual, where we're emphasizing how they're coming out, so that, sure, the overarching teachings of, whether it's karma or liberation or the role of meditation or the Four Noble Truths or the 5 precepts, all these, the Eightfold Noble Path, all these things that really bind us. Okay, that's great. Let's start with that. But then let's talk about the differences and how they play out. And it was, it took me years to even realize as a practitioner that was a thing, let alone to know what to do with it. So.
I think it's quite interesting, and that's where many of us find our challenges in connecting with communities and building sangha when we're living as expats or foreigners in different spaces. And that's why often in countries that I've been to and lived in, we've seen foreigners creating their own sanghas within those spaces outside of some of the formal centers and communities to continue practice, continue supporting each other.
Right. It can be a challenge to see what degree of balance you want with how you're taking from the local culture and learning from it and growing, and how you're also serving your own needs and where you come from, which can be different. And I think Thailand, more than Burma, given the nature of the history, has done more experimentation in that way, like Wat Pah Nanachat or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, towards this end, you found the Wandering Meditators in 2008. It has, quote, the intention of helping meditators by bridging the gap between Eastern and Western meditation centers and styles, and taking the mindfulness practice out of the center and into the world. So that's quite a lofty goal. That's great. A great description of an aim that could really be quite helpful. in more practical ways on the ground. Can you tell a little more what that looks like?
Intentionally, it was really putting something out there to try to fill that need that we've been talking about. Initially, we were looking at being able to offer more things like that are being done somewhat here with meditation tours and finding ways to help facilitate people into centers, helping them find the right centers to practice in that would have would meet their style or needs or time and so forth. That, because of other things happening in life, didn't come to fruition as much as initially expected, because we ended up moving a few times. And over the last few years, though, being here in Yangon and settling in, I've started using that platform to help support people in our drop-in groups that we have, our weekly drop-in group here in Yangon. And as people often in this community tend to be transient and traveling quite a bit, we started creating this live stream of the weekly meditations to help keep the community connected and allow people access even if they were traveling or if they have moved and wanted to stay in contact. And again, it's that same intention of trying to make these teachings or create a space where they could be more accessible, that you don't have to know about the Dharma or don't have to be talking specifically about the Buddha's teachings to find ways to develop a practice, to be more mindful, to understand these core components of meditation. And we spend a lot of time in discussion as well of looking at how to make them more accessible, how to integrate these practices into daily life, and just keeping that open and looking at it as a community space to be learning from each other and supporting each other in this without the formalities of being in a center or of a specific tradition or needing any of the other baggage that sometimes comes along with these practices.
Right. So you do that at Alliance Francaise once a week. So if any expats are listening or you're passing through, this is a great opportunity to join. And also interesting that you have to bring in the recent political history, that this is the kind of thing you probably couldn't have done 5 years ago. Yeah. Anything such as this was looked upon suspicion. Even foreign monks, dedicated practitioners coming to established monasteries, such as with Sayadaw U Tejaniya or Mahasi Sayadaw, had a lot of trouble just being able to stay there. So what you're doing is, in a sense, a result of the country being able to open up and foreigners able to get together under happy circumstances and share the Dhamma teachings in their own way that's comfortable to them, and to do so without suspicion in a freer way. So,
and we also have people that come in that are from Myanmar as well, and and some of the feedback there has been that it's a more relaxed way to be able to sit and not have to wear certain clothes or act in a certain way or be expected to perform certain things. And so it's been an interesting mix of culture and people along the way.
Younger Burmese, I'd probably guess.
Yes, mostly.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting, because when Thabawa Sayadaw was on, and this part of the interview hasn't aired yet, but one of the things he said in the second interview is that that Myanmar is changing very fast, and that when he goes to the meditation centers and monasteries, he sees that there are no young people there. They're not sitting, they're not serving, they're not involved. And if this old traditional style of Burmese Buddhism continues as it has unabated, without any kind of concept or understanding of what the needs are at the bottom, and you're just top down implementing what's always been done, then it's going to be very staid and non-applicable, non-relevant to who you really are and what you need. And so that's why he has adapted his teaching so much. in very novel and unconventional and somewhat controversial ways to conservative Burmese Buddhist society to want to meet people more where they're at. So I think it's really interesting as this country opens up and the needs become different, that there are opportunities of teaching and reaching them that are also trying new things, some of which might not always work in perfect ways, that you're experimenting and you're fine. On the outside, it looks like, well, this isn't what's been done before and it's not according to this custom, but it's also able to bring people in to giving them what they need, even if the forms are different.
Yeah. And I think that's important to see as, Buddhism and meditation and Dharma evolves here, but also globally. And, this idea of how it did move to the West and how it grew in the West and what that looks like. And people have different perspectives on, how that went. Mm-hmm. But just this idea of then people now coming back to places like Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and other places, and with these other perspectives and teaching methods and offering teachings in a way that could appeal and help the interest and help keep people in the Dharma and with practices.
And let more people in through the door.
Yes.
Yeah, open more doors for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of cultures, you spent 8 years in Thailand, I think it was, 5 years in Burma. You've practiced extensively in both. And it's funny because as close as these countries are geographically, historically, culturally, definitely religiously, it seems pretty rare that foreign practitioners are experienced in both of those places. Generally, we fall into the Burma yogis or the Thai yogis and kind of stick with the Ajahns or the Sayadaws. You've done somewhat of both. So I'm really interested how you would contrast the experience differently in these countries and cultures, especially in the context of the Dhamma teachings and monastic life.
Very delicately. It's a challenging question. I think both are quite different, and I often look at it just in terms of language even. While initially when we were traveling, we were in Nepal before arriving in Thailand, and our first plan was to come to Burma and meditate here. Many of the teachers that I had studied with in the U.S. Spoke very highly of the Burmese meditation tradition and the great teachers here. So our intention was to come here and meditate, but we needed visas. So we found that we had to go to Thailand first from Nepal because we didn't have access to get visas there. And when we arrived in Chiang Mai and we were in Thailand, we started learning more about what the political situation was like here in Burma at the time. And it was at a moment when the Saffron Revolution was going on. There was a lot of difficulties in the country.
2008 it must have been.
Yes. Yeah. So we made a decision at that point not to come here to study. And instead, we decided to do a 21-day meditation retreat in Chiang Mai at Wat Doi Suthep. And my wife suggested we do the 10-day retreat initially, and I was like, but they said 21 days, we can do it. And about 3 days into the retreat, I was ready to go, and she was very clear in her intentions and said, no, we're staying. We committed to 21, and we're staying, and ended up being a very, very important and fruitful retreat, and we learned a lot, and the teacher there was great. Interestingly, there was a lot of influence from Burmese teachers,
sure.
Particularly in Chiang Mai. So at Wat Doi Suthep, it was in the tradition from Ajahn Tong, from Wat Chom Tong, and several of the centers around Chiang Mai that we had studied at had been influenced in the style that he learned when he studied with Mahasi here. after the Buddhist council that he had attended. And so a lot of what we were learning had that Mahasi style and feel to it and adapted slightly. So it wasn't that far off. But at the same time, the structure of the centers, I feel, is quite different between the two countries.
Sure.
The lay community quite different, and the monks also, in my experience. The meditation practice is very strong here in Burma, and sitting at Shui Umin, for example, to be in the meditation hall with hundreds of people and monks from several different countries and practicing together and very strong meditation practices. I saw less frequently in some of the centers I was in Thailand. It felt more relaxed in many of the centers in Thailand. And I think there's something to be said for both approaches, and also there's differences in culture. I definitely, as I mentioned earlier, I think about it in terms of language a lot of times. And having lived in Thailand for 8 years, when we were planning to move to Myanmar, I thought it would be a much easier transition for me to learn Burmese than it was. I was like, my Thai's not great, but it's good enough.
Right.
I get by with Thai, and I should be able to pick up Burmese. It's next door, and it's tonal. And I was very wrong about that.
Right.
And I found a lot of these assumptions, to be false, and a lot of the differences.
Right.
They may seem subtle when you're zoomed out, looking and like, they're both Vipassana, they're both Theravada tradition, they're next door to each other. But there are a lot of differences in the way people practice, the way people understand the Dharma and learn the Dharma. I taught in a Buddhist university in Chiang Mai, teaching English and working with this program called Monk Chat for a while.
Right.
And they and it was monks from around Southeast Asia. So there was a large Khmer community of monks and Thai and Lao and Sri Lankan and Burmese. And you saw the difference in the way different students from different parts of Southeast Asia, who were all Theravadan monks, even approached learning, and it was a lot of their conditioning and so forth, and also in the way that they approached practice and their understanding of the practices and how much coming from, this was a university, they were studying for their bachelor's at the Buddhist university there, but just their background and how much practice went in and understanding of the Pali Canon and the Abhidhamma and so forth, and going into these programs very differently by countries. And I can't make assumptions in terms of, overall, just based on those experiences, but it was a very different approach from each culture in what I saw.
Yeah, it's interesting because you came to the Dhamma by having it come in a very specific form. Again, the tattooed people in New York City coming out of addiction, and yet you've then, and that was just a very specific narrow vessel that it had to reach you. But then after it reaching you and you committing your life to it, you've then gone into so many other diverse contexts and vessels that you haven't. In other words, you needed it to arrive in, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you needed it to arrive in that vessel for it to reach you. But then after developing some level of comfort, you were able to move outside of that little compartment and explore all these other different vessels in their own terms and different cultures and communities and approaches.
Yeah. I think that a lot of that is, when we look at the Eightfold Path, and we look at these different components, that key area of that effort, where does that fire come from? And you need that initial connection to really set you, not just to get on this path, but to maintain that momentum and that interest. And I think a lot of that has to do with connection and, how our experiences mold us into where we end up, and what kind of teachers that we seek out, and types of practices. And I feel I was lucky to have found a group that I connected with in that way. And and along the way, there have been different communities that, I've really learned from in different ways, and have gained so much from in different ways, that I think it all just kind of is important in terms of understanding what works and what doesn't. Again, going back to at what point we're at.
Right. And looking more specifically at Myanmar, you've spent time in other Buddhist countries, and I liked what you said a little bit ago about how the immediate assumptions you made of Myanmar, whether it was language or culture or country, how incorrect they were. And that cracked me up, thinking that I don't know if any assumptions that people can make about Myanmar could be correct until they come, because it is such a different place. I think whether you're coming as a dedicated Buddhist practitioner with stories that you've heard from your tradition or community, you're in for a shock. I think if you're coming to want to learn Buddhism for the first time, to want to practice meditation for the first time, things are going to surprise you. Some, as again, referencing back Alan's interview, some people come with such dedication, they're really willing to put up with any conditions, but it is the lived life here is different than those outer assumptions, and that's part of the reason of this podcast, to have a real truth-telling of the highs and the inspirations, and also some of the challenges of being here, and both sides of this dynamic. You've spent time in other Buddhist countries and Buddhist cultures. I'm curious, Myanmar specifically, how do you find it unique in this ways? What aspects of the practice or the culture here have been different than other forms of Buddhist culture and practice you've been exposed to?
I think I guess after being in Thailand for so many years, seeing how many lay people that I meet that go to centers and actively practice.
Here or in Thailand, you're saying?
Here in Burma.
Right.
The amount of people that I've talked to about meditation that have, they take their holidays and go and go to a center, and that's not something that I've seen in other countries as much. Just in terms of that dedication and actually practice. I think I've seen many people in other countries go and provide offerings and maybe go for this more cultural or ritualistic experience, becoming a monk for a day or a few days, or making offerings and so forth, doing things to meet cultural or familial expectations. Whereas here in Burma, I've seen and had so many conversations with people that go on retreat because they're working on their mind, they're working on their karma, they're working on, building and developing their practice, and have an understanding of that much more than what I've seen in other places. But I don't want to make such a wide assumption because there are practitioners and.
No, I think that's fair, though. I mean, I remember the thing that hooked me when I first came to this country as a meditator in 2003 was that, I was having high-level Dhamma conversations with a taxi driver, a waiter at a restaurant, a hotel clerk. I mean, and these aren't just, these are actual examples. I remember who these people were. And not just you do meditation, that's good, but you do Goenka, he does this systematic approach, and I go to Mogok because I think it's really important, as the Buddha talked about this kind of teaching, and the Mogok Sayadaw has this kind of presentation, but with Goenka, he has this take on it, and that's also quite nice, but this other element is here. And I was blown away. I was I would hardly expect this conversation with a Buddhist scholar, and these are just people in their normal practices, and made me think, think, there's these stereotypes of like, you get into a cab in Paris and you're going to have a conversation about the historic development of the French language, because it's just something everyone has an opinion about. And thinking about that in the Myanmar context, it was just like, no matter what your and again, this is a blanket statement. It's a little bit of a general thing to say, but the attention on the mind and the development on the mind and the desire to be in the accordance of what the Buddha actually taught and to measure your experience with what you understand of the scriptures as your teacher or various teachers are coming to you, that is just a topic of conversation and thought that people talk about here like they might talk about sports somewhere else. Except it has much more meaning, obviously, and much more stakes attached to it. But people really, right. Yeah, don't say that to a Dallas Cowboys fan or something. But, you could be here and engage in those conversations no matter what the person's background and training. And that was just something that absolutely blew me away. And at one point I was at a pagoda, and it was Thambodi Pagoda in Moniwa, and there was a group of, what was it, like 50 college kids on spring break that had just come to the pagoda to chant suttas and do good deeds and give offering. Just like, I don't want to tell you what kids in our country do on spring break,
I think we talked about that earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, right. You had a long spring break. Yeah. So yeah, that's definitely that's a shade that attracted me. Yeah. Any other observations?
I think that really touches on it, and also just this. The understanding, like you said, of these different options as well, that it's not just, there are different methods, and that level of understanding and knowledge that's more readily available really is clear. Although looking at it from a standpoint of experiences in Nepal and like northern India with Tibetan and Vajrayana practices, people also understood the different traditions between, Kagyu and Gelugpa and so on, and really seeing that there were different forms of practices in different ways. And there was also a very critical understanding from many about the teachings. So I think there are some similarities there as well.
Right. Yeah, great. So just last topic here. Your interest in Dhamma came out of trauma and addiction, and you're now involved in various mental health issues here. Where do you see the intersection between mental health and Dhamma practice?
It's my life. That's the intersection.
Professionally, personally, yeah.
It's one of the main reasons I probably started to look at mental health was an interest in the mind. I studied psychology because I was already looking at the mind from a meditation, a Buddhist perspective, and wanted to balance that and understand what approaches were being taken in psychology and from the West. And I've had that interest over the years. And when I first started working in some of the camps in Thailand around mental health, I was actually first brought in to teach mindfulness and meditation for people living in refugee camps. And one of the before I started working on the mental health program specifically, one of the challenges I initially saw there was how to present these teachings that in my personal life had greatly impacted my ability to reduce the suffering in my life. I saw this as something that was a huge impact on my life in terms of being able to relieve suffering to create better coping mechanisms and more positive approach. But there were a lot of challenges in being able to teach or offer these teachings and these practices. And one of them was around religion. Because not everybody is Buddhist, not everyone is comfortable with learning something that's outside of their faith. And it was something learning how to work with people, as you said earlier, with where they are, rather than where you want them to be, and trying to transmit the value of something that you've learned in a way that is palatable to them, that people can accept, was something that really I took interest in and wanted to find ways to be able to offer something that kind of transcends a lot of the cultural and constructed barriers that I was seeing. And it's not always easy. It's interesting. I was brought into that work on the assumption again, and another assumption that gets people into trouble of, well, we're in Southeast Asia, we're in Asia, teach them yoga and meditation to help them out. It's working so well in the West. It really wasn't the case. It wasn't the best approach at that point, because there were Christian people in the camps, there were Muslim people in the camps, there were people that, if I talked about breathing even, just sitting down and watching your breath, immediately went to, well, that's meditation, which is Buddhist, and I can't do that because I'm not Buddhist. And it was just something that I really needed to evaluate or reevaluate in my own practices, and how we could overcome these things to find a way to help people, because there is evidence, as we know, that meditation and mindfulness can help people with trauma, with stress, with common mental health issues, and trying to find a way to then offer that to people of all faiths, of all backgrounds, people that aren't interested or attached. As I mentioned earlier, when I had first been introduced to 12-step programs, it was very faith-based, and that was something I wasn't able to connect with, and therefore didn't really have something that was a valuable tool to many. And this is something that I look to try to do with mindfulness and meditation, and how could that fit in a mental health space. So that's been part of that intersection of looking at, in some ways people see meditation as a fix to mental health issues in a place like Burma that has a strong, meditative community and is primarily Buddhist, but it's not all Buddhist, and it doesn't fit for everyone. And even amongst those Buddhists, like you said, people that are younger that may not be as connected to these traditions or want to partake in that might not access those tools or those services. So finding a way to make these things accessible to people, while looking at it from an evidence-based or evidence-informed approach has been an interest there. Like everywhere in the world, there's a lot of stigma around mental health. And it's no different here. The official the official stats and data in Myanmar, it's a bit bleak. The government says that at least 95% of those people that need mental health services do not have access to mental health services. And that's data from the government. And, as in many places, suicide, there's a lot of stigma around drug issues, substance abuse. We know that there are issues, and it's difficult to access services One, because there's limited services, and two, because there's a lot of stigma and disgrace around that. So mental health is a huge issue here, as it is everywhere in the world. Talking about mental health is something that we need to do more of. That being said, there's a lot of interest in mental health here. There's a lot of people and a lot of organizations working on mental health. The government, the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Social Welfare are both interested in improving the mental health conditions here, and have been putting a lot of effort into that. And that's something that has improved dramatically in the time I've been here. We've seen a lot of strides in that, though obviously a lot more needs to be done. There's a lot more access to services, as you would expect, here in Yangon than there are outside of the city, and there's quite a lot to do.
Great. Thanks. Last question. What's been your favorite place to meditate in Myanmar?
My house. But I would definitely say that Shui U Min has been a special center in terms of its openness, its method, approach, access to teacher, community, and just overall feeling. I've really felt that the teachings are clear there. The books are accessible. The teacher is available. The food's pretty good.
Always important.
Always important.
Yeah.
And just, I felt that there was a good space. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and best of luck with the work you're doing.
Thanks.
I know for a lot of podcast listeners, as soon as the fundraising requests start up, you kind of just zone out and skip ahead till it's over. But I ask that if you've taken the time to listen to our full podcast, that you also take the time to consider our spiel. Some may assume that producing a 2-hour episode wouldn't take much more time than the conversation itself. But so much goes into it. In advance of the interview, our content team reviews the biography and relevant works of the upcoming guest, and we discuss the best way to use our limited time together. After the interview is complete, the raw audio file is sent to our sound engineer, who shapes it into working order. A single episode can take several full days of solid production work in the studio, which is then carefully coordinated with our content team to ensure smooth listening. Further edits and post-production magic bring the eventual episode to your ears, along with extensive written descriptions of each interview, which we publish on our blog and on social media as well. Many of these steps require an outlay of funds in some way or another. We hope that each episode helps to inform you about the ongoing crisis, and if you find it of value, we also hope that you can consider supporting our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support. Perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.